I'm Nigel Appleton. I'm Executive Chairman of Contact Consulting, which is a niche consultancy that specialises in the housing, health and care needs of older people. I founded the business in 1995, and prior to that, for 10 years I'd worked for Anchor Housing, which was the largest provider of specialist housing for older people in the UK. In the early years, a lot of our work was for local authorities and not-for-profit organisations reviewing their services and their housing and suggesting improvement. Out of that came work with local authorities looking at how they could plan for an ageing population, and that in turn led to work for central government, for the Department of Health, the Department of Environment, and a publication in 2008 of a report called More Choice, Greater Voice, which was the first attempt to set down some targets for future provision. In terms of housing, we're nowhere near the level of provision that we need, nor the diversity of provision that we need to meet the variety of the current population of older people. And we're not even at a baseline for that, let alone in a position to cope with the rising number of older people over the next decade and more. There's no agreed level of what provision ought to be, but one view would be that we're at least 70% below where we ought to be in providing properly for the older population. We're living through a period of enormous increase in the number of older people. If we look at those not just already in old age, however one wants to define that, but those approaching old age, so let's say 55 plus, they're already 30% of the total population, and within the next 2 decades that will become 35%. So we're not talking about a small number of people, we're talking about the needs of a very large proportion of the population. And if we can offer those, particularly those in approaching old age and in early old age, a reason to make a preemptive move rather than making a last minute scramble when they can no longer cope where they are, then we shall really be making progress in offering appropriate housing and giving people a chance for a constructive and worthwhile experience of old age. One of the biggest problems we have is a lack of imagination and creativity in providing housing for older people. There's a long history of specialist provision for older people. Almshouses, for example, go back into the 15th and 16th century. Sheltered housing began to emerge in the 1950s, 1960s. And for a lot of people, that's where their understanding of what's appropriate has stuck. But the needs, aspirations and personal circumstances of people in and approaching old age have transformed over the last 30, 40 years, and imagination and creativity haven't kept up. We're still seeing the promotion of models which are stuff we've had for a long time with a few embellishments, rather than a fundamental rethink about what the rising generation of older people will want and need. And given that a very high proportion of them are owner-occupiers, many of them owner-occupiers with limited other resources. You know, their home is their biggest resource to draw on to fund their old age. Many of them are under-provided for. They're squeezed out. They don't qualify for some social housing for older people. They can't afford much of the commercial offer of housing for older people. And we just need to be much more creative to match what's offered to the diversity of circumstances that we're seeing emerge now. I was introduced to Rob Scott by a professional colleague with whom I'd worked on other projects, and he thought that we would have a similar approach to the challenges of providing housing for older people. Rob has a depth of experience in development and was beginning, when we began that conversation, to feel that it needed something more, that more could be done. There could be a better fit between what developers of housing provided and what older people needed and would need in the future. And there was an instant rapport. And as he's gone forward with that project, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with him about how those plans have emerged, how his thoughts have progressed over time. And it's very exciting to feel that now that's going to get expressed in developments on the ground and opportunities for older people to have options that currently simply aren't there. For many years, the leading edge for new development was the not-for-profit sector, housing associations. Increasingly at the moment, it tends to be commercial providers, but providers of premium product, which is outside the reach of many, many older people. The costs are just beyond what they can afford. Not just the purchase cost, but the service charges for ongoing occupation. And so there is a need for something that is affordable, allows people to stay in the communities with which they have connection, where their roots are, stops this migration of older people out of rural areas and into the towns, but allows them to age in place, which is what most of us want. And Rob, through this venture of Lewis and Scott, has a real commitment to making that possible. And the model that has emerged from that thinking reflects that commitment, that personal commitment from Rob, and the commitment from the organisation, Lewis and Scott, that he's now created, that will deliver those opportunities to local people in an affordable way, in a sustainable way, within local communities. The model that Lewis and Scott are promoting brings together a whole lot of positive elements. Affordability to local populations of older people without compromising in the quality of what's provided, and an overall approach which makes it a good place to live immediately, but has the resilience to provide for changing needs as people pass through old age there. So for the great majority of people, it will be a last move. They'll be able to live out their old age there and to enjoy that life because of the design values which are going into these developments, not just the design and accessibility of the individual dwellings, but their setting in a garden courtyard. It responds not just to physical need or health problems or functional difficulties of getting about. It responds to the need for well-being, for a positive atmosphere, for the ability to enjoy your life in old age whilst maintaining your independence. Unlike many other needs that housing has to respond to, the need to respond to our old age is something that all of us will face. Some of us a lot sooner than others, but we find that difficult. Part of the contribution of the Lewis and Scott model is that it gives something positive to look forward to in old age. That can only be good. It can help us as individuals think more positively about what our old age might be like, and it can help whole communities think positively about how they can maintain a mixed age group, how grandparents can still live alongside grandchildren in the same community. And we look to public authorities, planners, councillors, and those who make those decisions to recognise the enormous benefit that will flow from this, not just for individuals, but for whole communities.